By 8:00 p.m., Deanna had called everyone. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Shirley MacLaine, Jerry Lewis, who Dean hadn't spoken to in 20 years, picked up on the first ring. "I'll find him," he promised. By midnight, Frank Sinatra had made a call. Within an hour, the FBI was searching for Dean Martin. By 3:00 a.m., every police department in Southern California had his photo. At 4:47 a.m., a security guard named Michael Torres found him. Forest Lawn Memorial Park, Glendale, California. Michael Torres had been a security guard at Forest Lawn for 11 years. He'd seen everything: grieving widows, drunk teenagers, people trying to steal flowers from Humphrey Bogart's grave, but he'd never seen anything like this. A man lying on the ground, curled into a fetal position against a gravestone. Michael ran closer, his flashlight cutting through the fog. The man was wearing an expensive suit, now soaked with dew and dirt. No shoes, no socks. His bare feet were blue from the cold. Michael knelt down, reached for the man's shoulder, and recognized his face. Dean Martin. Michael had seen him perform at the Sands in 1975. He'd bought his daughter a Dean Martin album for Christmas. He'd watched the Dean Martin show every Thursday night for 9 years. And now Dean Martin was lying on the ground, shivering, barely breathing. "Mr. Martin," Michael said, gently shaking his shoulder. "Mr. Martin, can you hear me?" Dean's eyes opened, but they didn't focus. They stared past Michael, through him, at something Michael couldn't see. "He gets cold," Dean whispered. "He gets so cold out here." "Who gets cold, Mr. Martin?" "My boy, my dino, he's cold. I can feel it." Michael followed Dean's gaze to the gravestone he was pressed against. Dean Paul Martin, Captain, California Air National Guard. November 17, 1951. March 21, 1987. The sky was never the limit. Michael's throat tightened. He knew this story. Everyone in Los Angeles knew this story. Dean Paul Martin, fighter pilot, actor, athlete, dead at 35 when his F-4 Phantom jet vanished into the San Bernardino Mountains during a routine training mission. They searched for days, found the wreckage scattered across a frozen mountainside. No body, just pieces. And Dean Martin, the man who never cried on camera, who joked through his own mother's funeral, had collapsed at the memorial service and couldn't stand back up. Now, 9 months later, he was lying on his son's grave in the middle of the night, barefoot, telling a stranger his boy was cold. "Mr. Martin," Michael said softly, "we need to get you inside. You're freezing." "No," Dean's hand tightened around the gravestone. "No, I can't leave him. Not tonight, not on his birthday." Michael glanced again at the dates. March 21 was Dean Paul's birthday. It was the day he died. "Please," Dean whispered, his voice breaking. "He's scared. He doesn't like the dark. I have to stay with him." Michael reached for his radio to call for help. Before he could speak, Dean grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Did you know," Dean said, suddenly clear, "he wanted to be a pilot since he was 6. I bought him a model airplane. He slept with it every night. I thought it was a phase." Michael didn't know what to say. "I should have stopped him," Dean said. "I should have told him no, I'm his father. I could have said no." "He called me the night before," Dean continued. "Said he loved me. Said he couldn't wait to come home and play golf with his old man." Dean's eyes filled with tears. "He was coming home, Michael. He was coming home, and I was going to tell him I was proud of him. I never told him enough. I never." Dean couldn't finish. His whole body shook, and Michael realized it wasn't from the cold. It was grief. Pure, unfiltered grief. The kind that doesn't care if you're Dean Martin or a stranger on the street. The kind that makes a 70-year-old man climb a cemetery fence in a $3,000 suit with no shoes because he can't stand the thought of his son being alone in the dark. Michael called for an ambulance. Within 20 minutes, Dean was wrapped in blankets, loaded into the back of an emergency vehicle. Deanna arrived just as the doors were closing. "Dad," she screamed, running toward him. Dean looked at her hollow-eyed. "I couldn't leave him," he said. "Not tonight." Deanna climbed into the ambulance and held her father while he sobbed. At the hospital, doctors treated Dean for hypothermia. He'd been lying on that grave for over 8 hours. Another hour, they said, and he might not have survived. Frank Sinatra arrived at dawn. He walked into Dean's hospital room, took one look at his oldest friend, and broke down crying. "Dino," Frank whispered, "you can't do this. You can't leave us too." Dean didn't respond. He just stared at the ceiling. Over the next few days, as the story leaked to the press, the truth came out. Dean Martin had been going to his son's grave every single night since the funeral. Not occasionally, every night. He'd drive to Forest Lawn after dark, climb the fence if the gates were closed, sit by Dean Paul's grave for hours talking to him, telling him about his day, apologizing over and over for not stopping him from flying. The cemetery staff knew. They'd seen him dozens of times, but they never said anything. They just let him grieve. Some nights, a groundskeeper later said, he'd hear Dean Martin, the greatest singer in the world, sitting on the ground in the dark, softly singing "Everybody Loves Somebody" to his dead son. The night Michael found him was different only because Dean hadn't left. He arrived at sunset and stayed because it was March 21, 1 year since Dean Paul died. Dean Martin couldn't bear the thought of his son being alone on the anniversary of his death. To understand why this broke Dean Martin, you have to understand who Dean Paul was. He wasn't just Dean's son, he was his best friend. Dean Paul Martin was a Renaissance man, a professional tennis player, actor, fighter pilot, married to Olympic figure skater Dorothy Hamill. He could have lived off his father's name, taken the easy path, but he wanted to earn everything himself. He joined the California Air National Guard in 1980, became an F-4 Phantom pilot, rose to the rank of captain. Dean was terrified. Every time his son flew, Deanna Martin later said, her father couldn't sleep. He'd sit up all night waiting for the phone to ring, praying it wouldn't. On March 21, 1987, the phone rang. Dean Paul's jet had disappeared during a training mission in the San Bernardino Mountains. The weather was bad, visibility near zero. They found the wreckage 3 days later. No survivors, no bodies, just twisted metal scattered across a frozen mountainside. Dean Martin, the man who joked through everything, who turned tragedy into one-liners, couldn't speak for a week. At the memorial service, Frank Sinatra gave the eulogy. Dean sat in the front row, stone-faced and silent. When it was over, he stood up to leave and collapsed. "I can't do this," Dean whispered. "I can't bury my boy." Frank held him while he cried. "You don't have to bury him," Frank said. "You just have to let him rest." But Dean never did. Dean Martin never recovered. After that night in the cemetery, he stopped going to his son's grave during the day, but he never stopped going at night. Deanna tried to stop him. She hid his car keys. She slept outside his bedroom door. It didn't matter. Dean would call a cab or walk or find a way. He wasn't trying to die, Deanna said years later. He was trying to be with his son the only way he knew how. In 1988, Dean performed his last concert at Bally's Casino in Las Vegas. He forgot the words to "Everybody Loves Somebody." He stopped mid-song, looked at the audience and said, "I'm sorry, folks, I don't remember how this one goes anymore." He walked off the stage and never performed again. On Christmas Day, 1995, Dean Martin died. Respiratory failure, the doctor said. But everyone who knew him knew the truth. Dean Martin died of a broken heart. At his funeral, Frank Sinatra didn't speak. He couldn't. He sat in the front row, holding Dean's daughter's hand, crying. They buried Dean Martin at Westwood Village Memorial Park, not at Forest Lawn where Dean Paul is buried. Deanna made that decision deliberately. "Dad spent the last 8 years of his life visiting my brother's grave," she explained. "I didn't want people visiting his grave. I wanted him to finally rest." But here's what most people don't know. On Dean's gravestone, there's a small engraving at the bottom. Most visitors miss it. It reads, "Together again with Dino." Because Deanna knew her father never stopped waiting to be reunited with his son. The world remembers Dean Martin as the king of cool, the effortless singer, the comedian who never seemed to try, the man with the martini glass and the smile. But that night in Forest Lawn Cemetery revealed who he really was. A father who loved his son so deeply he couldn't accept he was gone. A man who would rather freeze on a grave than let his boy spend one night alone. A human being who learned that some pain is too deep to joke away. Michael Torres, the security guard who found Dean, was interviewed once about that night. "I've seen a lot of grief in this job," he said, "but I've never seen anything like that." Dean Martin, a giant of entertainment, reduced to a shivering man whispering to a piece of stone because he couldn't let go. Michael paused. "But you know what? I don't think it was about letting go. I think Dean knew his son was gone. I think he just couldn't stand the thought of him being alone." That's the Dean Martin story nobody tells. Not the Rat Pack legend, not the Hollywood icon. The father who climbed a cemetery fence in a $3,000 suit with no shoes because his son was cold. The man who sang "Everybody Loves Somebody" to an empty grave for 8 years. The king of cool who learned that some things can't be joked away, can't be sung away, can't be cooled away. Some things just hurt forever. If this story moved you, remember this. Dean Martin spent his entire career making people laugh. But the greatest thing he ever did was love his son. Even after death, even in the dark, even when nobody was watching. That's not just a father's love. That's forever.